I was branded the crazy one for asking questions. 20 years later, I exposed my family's lies and taught my kids the truth they tried to bury. I grew up in a narrow two-story house on the edge of a tired neighborhood in Hartford, sandwiched between an older brother who could do no wrong and a baby sister who seemed to float above consequences. My name is Camille, and by the time I turned 13, I had already been assigned a permanent role in our household story. Moody, difficult, emotional, unpredictable. It didn't matter what I said or did. If I raised my voice, I was hysterical, and if I stayed quiet, I was sulking. The rules applied differently to me, and everyone seemed more comfortable pretending I didn't exist unless there was something to criticize. Trent, my brother, was 18 when he won a statewide science competition, and our living room turned into a shrine. My parents threw him a party and told anyone who listened that they always knew he'd go far. Brielle, my sister, was 8 at the time and barely spoke above a whisper, which they interpreted as being angelic rather than avoidant. She was coddled constantly, even when she deliberately broke things or lied. I wasn't allowed to be angry about that because being angry, according to my mother, meant I was spiraling. I remember the first time the word unstable came up. I had cried during a presentation in history class, not loud, just enough to tremble through the last few sentences. I got sent to the counselor, and 2 days later, I wasn't in public school anymore. My mother told me it was for my own good, that the world was too harsh, and she could teach me better at home. But what that meant was sitting at the kitchen table with packets she printed from outdated websites while she paced the room, telling phone friends that I was having episodes. I didn't know what she meant, and when I asked, she said I wouldn't understand until I was older. One afternoon, she told our neighbor that I was showing early signs of a borderline personality. I didn't even know what that was. I looked it up in an old library book and cried in my room for an hour, unsure if something really was wrong with me or if they just didn't want to deal with the person I was becoming. The worst part was how fast it spread. At a cousin's backyard birthday, one of the girls I barely knew pulled me aside and whispered, "You're the broken one, right?" I was 14, and suddenly the rest of the family stopped making eye contact when I walked into her room. Everything I did, from the way I dressed to how long I stayed quiet, was watched, measured, and inevitably misunderstood. If I laughed too loud, I was manic. If I said I was tired, I was slipping again. When I turned 18, I left without telling anyone. I packed 2 garbage bags and slipped out just after sunrise on a Wednesday. I found a shared apartment above a corner store in Albany and got a job at a bookstore that paid cash until I could register for community college. I didn't send letters. I didn't pick up when they called. I changed my number and let the silence take shape around me like armor. For the first time, I could feel my own thoughts without someone second-guessing every word. But it didn't take long for the stories to catch up to me. An old family friend ran into me at a coffee shop and asked if I was okay, said my mom was beside herself with worry. According to her, I had vanished after a breakdown and wasn't answering anyone because I was ashamed. She said it like she thought she was being kind, like she believed the myth because no one had ever told her anything else. What no one asked was whether I left because I was sane, because I was finally starting to see through the fog they'd wrapped around me since childhood. My parents had told everyone their version, one where I had lost my grip on reality and they were doing their best to love me through it. It didn't matter that I had never seen a psychiatrist, never had a diagnosis, never even been evaluated by anyone outside of a school counselor who said I was just overwhelmed. At 21, I made the mistake of going back for Trent's engagement party. I told myself I could handle one evening, that it was just a chance to show I was fine. They greeted me with tight hugs and overly bright smiles, as if I had simply come back from a vacation. My father clapped me on the back and said, "Glad to see you're back to your old self," and I stood there wondering who that even was. Later that night, I overheard my aunt asking my mother if I was medicated now. My mother nodded slowly and said, "She's doing better now. The structure helps." I hadn't taken a single pill in my life. I hadn't even been prescribed anything. But it didn't matter. The story had taken on a life of its own. According to them, I had borderline tendencies, a phrase they probably found in a magazine or late-night show and decided fit me. When I tried to talk to my mother about it after the party, she sighed heavily and said, "We're just concerned. That's all." My father stood behind her with his arms crossed like a judge waiting to deliver a sentence. I told them I was fine, that I always had been, but they didn't hear me. They only heard the version of me they had constructed: fragile, reactive, unpredictable, and always on the verge of collapse. I left without saying goodbye, and I didn't answer when they called. Again, I knew I wasn't going to be able to erase the story they'd told, but I could at least stop it from being the only one that existed. The next day, I started journaling, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. This time, it wasn't just for me. It was for the version of myself that had been erased. For the girl they called unstable because she asked too many questions. For the woman they refused to believe because the lie was easier to repeat. When I met Malcolm, I wasn't looking for someone to save me, just someone who wouldn't treat my silence like a warning sign or ask me if I was okay every time I blinked twice. He was steady in a way that made people relax, a public school English teacher who knew how to hold space without taking it over. I told him early on that my family didn't speak to me much, and he didn't press me for details. He just nodded like that made perfect sense, like some families don't deserve second chances. By the time I was 28, I'd moved again, this time into a small house with Malcolm in a town just outside Trenton. It had a crooked fence, too many trees in the yard, and a kitchen with windows that faced the morning sun. That year, after weeks of gentle nudging, I agreed to see a therapist. I wasn't nervous about the sessions themselves, but about the possibility that maybe my parents had been right, that maybe I really was broken. But the woman I saw didn't treat me like a ticking clock. She listened and asked questions without assuming she already knew the answers. By our third session, she leaned forward and asked why no one had ever brought me in as a child. I shrugged and said my mother thought she knew best. The therapist didn't smile. She said, "Everything you've described sounds like a perfectly normal reaction to chronic invalidation and emotional manipulation." Then she used a word that landed like a weight across my ribs: gaslighting. I went home that night and cried in the bathroom, not because I was sad, but because I finally had a name for the thing that haunted every interaction with my parents. Malcolm didn't say much. He just sat outside the door and waited until I was ready to talk. A year later, we got married in a quiet ceremony at the courthouse and celebrated with a picnic in the park. No family, no drama, just us and a few close friends. We had our daughter, Nora, the following spring, and our son Eli 3 years later. I wanted to believe I could raise them in peace, without the shadow of what had come before me. For a while, it worked. I agreed to small visits with my parents, always in public places, always with Malcolm nearby. No overnights, no unsupervised trips, just polite conversations and tight smiles. I convinced myself that was enough, that the past didn't need to be dug up if I kept a safe distance. But then one night, as I helped Nora brush her teeth, she looked up and asked, "Why does Grandma think you're not right in the head?" My hand stopped mid-air, toothbrush paused. I asked where she'd heard that, and she said her cousin Lila had told her during a sleepover. Lila, Brielle's daughter. They were playing a game. And Lila had explained that I wasn't allowed to make big decisions because I had something wrong with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I scrolled through old messages, journal entries, the file of printed emails I'd started after the engagement party years ago. I remembered the time my mother sobbed in front of dinner guests because I'd asked to leave early. The time she called my first boss and told him I needed a break for emotional reasons. He cut my hours the next day. I called Brielle to confront her. She brushed it off like it was a joke, said kids mix things up. Then she added something that hit me like a slap. "You know how Mom is. We all just try to keep the peace." I hung up and stared at the wall. It wasn't just our parents anymore. Brielle was using the story too, probably to look stable in comparison. The story had become her shield. The next morning, Malcolm and I sat down and agreed. No more unsupervised contact. No exceptions, no excuses. If they wanted access to the kids, it would happen in the open, with us present. A week later, we went to a birthday party at Trent's house. Everyone was there: our parents, cousins, old family friends. As soon as we arrived, my mother tried to pull Nora and Eli inside. I stepped between them and said we'd be staying in the backyard. It was a warm day. The kids would be fine outside. She frowned like I'd slapped her, then turned it into a public scene, tears and all. "Why do you keep punishing me for the past?" she asked loudly in front of everyone. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Because you're still doing it." Then I turned around and walked away. That night, I received an email from my father. Long, dense paragraphs accusing me of paranoia, of damaging the family, of being unwell and refusing help. He said keeping the kids away was abusive. I forwarded the message to my therapist. Her reply was one sentence: textbook emotional manipulation. I printed the email and slid it into a folder I'd been keeping for months. Inside were screenshots, old messages, even a voicemail my mother had left during a meltdown over Christmas plans. I labeled the folder when they asked why. That same week, I started writing stories for my kids. Not as revenge, not to indoctrinate, but so they'd have a version of events that wasn't soaked in silence. I kept the stories simple, with a girl who was often misunderstood, who asked too many questions, and who never stopped trying to be kind even when it made other people uncomfortable. Nora asked if the girl was me. I told her yes. Eli asked if the girl got better. I said she wasn't broken to begin with. Then one afternoon, I received a group invite from my mother for a family fall retreat. She wrote, "I hope we can act like adults and move past this nonsense for the sake of the children." I didn't respond. Brielle messaged later and asked if I was really going to ruin a good time over old drama. I took a screenshot and added it to the folder. Malcolm said something that stuck with me. "You're not rewriting history. You're recording what actually happened before they bury it." That night, I started a private blog titled Pieces of the Real. Password protected, no names, no direct accusations, just bedtime story versions of memories. The first post was about a girl who asked hard questions and got told she was too much. I left out the worst parts but didn't water down the truth. It wasn't for the world. It was for my children, for the future versions of them who might one day need to understand why our family is shaped the way it is. If they ever wondered why we didn't go to Grandma's house or why birthday parties made me tense, I wanted the answer to be there, even if I wasn't. Because they deserve more than silence. They deserve a story that belongs to them, not one passed down in whispers. A few days after we got back from the birthday party, Nora brought me a school flyer about a class assignment on family stories. She asked if she could talk about one of the bedtime tales I'd written, the one about the girl who wasn't broken, just misunderstood. I hesitated, then told her she could tell whatever story she wanted, as long as it was true for her. She nodded seriously and said she knew exactly what she wanted to say. 3 days later, I got a call from her teacher asking if I could come in and discuss her project. The meeting wasn't aggressive, just cautious. The principal said that Nora's essay had raised concerns, particularly the way she described emotional abuse and being taught to tell the truth even when it made people uncomfortable. I sat there and explained everything calmly, not in detail, not naming names, but enough to clarify that Nora wasn't in danger. I told them she had learned to see through lies not because she was coached, but because she'd seen what dishonesty does to a family. They offered to let her revise the project. I declined. She had told the truth. She hadn't accused anyone directly. She'd just shared a story about honesty and resilience, and that didn't require editing. After the meeting, I went home and opened the binder labeled "When They Ask Why." I added a new section titled "When They Start Seeing It." That night, Eli asked me if it was true that he might need to be tested like me. I didn't understand what he meant until he said that Lila had told him he might have something wrong because he was my son. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled out the blog and wrote a new post about a little boy who loved to collect feathers and how someone once said he was weird because of it. But the girl in the story told him he wasn't weird, he was curious, and that was something worth protecting. I printed the post, folded it into an envelope, and added it to the binder. Then I created another one and labeled it "When They Want More." That's where I started storing the printed blog entries, scanned emails, screenshots, and anything else that didn't fit into bedtime stories but still needed to be remembered. The next time we saw Brielle was at a neighborhood gathering. She acted like nothing had happened, like our kids hadn't been repeating the stories her daughter had passed along. I didn't bring it up. I just watched the way she softened her voice when she spoke to the others, the way she tilted her head and made herself small, like she'd mastered how to seem innocent even while twisting the truth. A few days later, I got a voicemail from my father. He said the family was planning a small dinner for his retirement and hoped I'd reconsider attending. I didn't call back. Tessa messaged me instead, asking if I was really going to hold a grudge during a happy moment. I replied with a scanned journal page from when I was 15, the one where I wrote about having a panic attack at a barbecue and overhearing my mother tell a neighbor I probably forgot to take my crazy pills. Tessa's response was a single line: You're rewriting history. I printed it and slid it into the folder under a new tab called the response pattern. I started annotating the journal entries with captions like footnotes, explaining the context and meaning behind each moment. Not just what happened, but what it taught me. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I emailed Susan, my father's sister, the only relative who had ever quietly believed me. I hadn't seen her since my wedding, but I remembered her pulling me aside once and saying, "You're not broken, Camille. You're just growing in a house that punishes growth." She replied that same evening, said she'd always suspected something was wrong ever since her own childhood. She shared stories about being blamed for things her brothers did, about being told she was hysterical when she cried at their mother's funeral. She even remembered my mother telling people I was having outbursts before I was 10. We talked for hours. I asked if I could record our conversation. She said yes. I saved the file to my external drive and added a transcript to the memoir I'd been building. Susan's voice was clear and steady. She didn't hesitate when she described the ways our family protected its image more than its children. After we hung up, I updated the timeline I'd been keeping. I color-coded it, blue for my memories, red for anything Nora or Eli witnessed, green for external confirmations like Susan's. It took weeks, but it felt like putting puzzle pieces in place after years of being told there was no picture to begin with. Once it was done, I made an anonymous email and sent screenshots of the family group chat, the one I'd found on Lila's tablet with all the relatives speculating about my mental state, to every single participant. I didn't include a message. I wanted them to see their own words and decide if they still felt justified. Gavin called first. I let it go to voicemail. He sounded furious, accused me of twisting things, of turning the family against each other. Said I needed to fix it before someone decided they were done with me for good. I didn't reply. I blocked his number. If someone gets blocked now, that's permanent. That's the rule. Later, Malcolm told me I wasn't alone in this anymore. That Susan had already done what no one else had, stood beside me in public, with evidence and truth. He said, "You don't need them to admit anything. You just need to make sure your kids never have to untangle the lies themselves." That same week, I emailed Nora's school counselor. I asked if she could meet with someone, not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted her to grow up knowing that asking for help was strength, not failure. They scheduled 2 sessions. I sat in the hallway while Nora talked about boundaries and trust and how adults can hurt you even when they say they love you. When it was over, the counselor told me Nora had an extraordinary sense of self and a rare ability to separate truth from performance. I nodded, thanked her, and went home to add a new section to the memoir, Voices Other Than Mine. It included Susan's transcript, the school counselor's summary, and the timeline. Then I updated the binder again and backed everything up to 2 drives, one hidden in my closet, one on Malcolm's encrypted device. Because if anything ever happened, I didn't want Nora or Eli to inherit silence. I wanted them to inherit proof. Proof that they were raised by someone who refused to let the lie be the only version that survived. A week after the group chat screenshots went out, the silence that followed felt more unnerving than any fight. No angry emails, no phone calls, no frantic backpedaling, just absence, as if they were waiting for me to apologize for holding a mirror to their behavior. I kept expecting some attempt at damage control, some performance of confusion or hurt, but what came instead was a letter. Not handwritten, not personal. A formal document delivered by certified mail, stamped with a lawyer's insignia and printed on thick paper like it was meant to scare me into silence. The letter demanded that I cease and desist the spreading of false and defamatory statements about my parents. It included vague warnings about potential legal action and the reputational harm being caused to the family. There were no specifics, no mention of which statements, which posts, which emails, just a blanket threat written in language designed to intimidate rather than inform. I didn't panic. I scanned the entire thing, then forwarded it to Malcolm's old college friend, who worked as a civil attorney in Brooklyn. He reviewed it that same evening and sent back a short reply. "This is noise. It's legally toothless. Don't let it shake you." With his help, we drafted a response. It was firm and factual. I had the right to speak honestly about my lived experiences, especially in private to my children. I wasn't seeking revenge or attention. I wasn't publishing names or seeking pity. I was documenting generational harm to prevent it from spreading further. We mailed it back, certified and signed. That was the end of the legal threats, at least for now. 2 days later, a package showed up on our front step. No return address, no card, just a weather-worn shoebox sealed with masking tape. Inside was what was left of my childhood photo album. Half of it burned, the pages charred and melted together in places. My baby pictures blackened, school photos singed around the edges. On top of the pile was a note written in red marker, each word jagged and uneven. It read, "You want to erase us? Consider it mutual." I didn't cry. I took pictures of every surviving page, then carefully scanned each one that still had a trace of image or handwriting. I cataloged the note, time-stamped the photos, and uploaded everything into the When They Ask Why folder. Afterward, I placed the remains in a sealed bag and disposed of them, not out of anger, but because I refused to let that destruction sit on our bookshelf like a trophy. That night, Eli climbed into my lap during a commercial break and asked, "Is Grandma a bad person?" I didn't rush to answer. I waited until I could speak clearly, then said, "She's someone who keeps choosing things that hurt people, even when she's been asked to stop. That doesn't make her evil, but it does make her unsafe." He nodded once, then rested his head on my shoulder and went back to watching cartoons. After the kids were asleep, I opened my laptop and plugged in my microphone. I created a new folder titled Final Record and hit the red circle to begin recording. I spoke without emotion, without performance. I narrated the story from beginning to now, the rumor, the labels, the assumptions. I explained how the story of my supposed condition had grown louder than anything I'd ever actually said. I listed dates. I quoted voicemails. I cited therapists. I detailed how the narrative had been used to discredit me, isolate me, and excuse cruelty. I ended the file with this line: "If you're ever told I wasn't safe, listen to this first." Then I saved the file, encrypted it, and backed it up in 2 places, on the hard drive in the lockbox under our bed and on Malcolm's cloud system. Because even if they tried again, even if the lies resurfaced years from now, there would be a record that couldn't be burned. A week later, Nora came home with a new assignment. Her class was preparing a presentation titled Family Legacy, and each student was expected to share a value passed down through generations. Nora asked if she could talk about truth. She said she wanted to include the stories I had told her, the ones I'd written as fables, the ones with the girl who asked too many questions and was told she was broken. I told her she could tell her version however she saw it. The day of the presentation, Malcolm and I sat at the back of the classroom. Nora stood at the front, confident and calm, and talked about how honesty sometimes feels harder than silence. She said bravery wasn't about being loud. It was about staying honest even when people wanted you to lie. She said that sometimes the people who claim to love you can also be the ones who hurt you most, and that love without accountability isn't love at all. She didn't name anyone. She didn't need to. Every adult in that room knew what she was saying. The next afternoon, I got an email from a parent whose daughter was close with Lila. She said she hadn't known the extent of what I'd endured growing up, but she wanted me to know that Nora's words had opened a conversation in their home. She ended the email with, "Your daughter speaks with more clarity than most adults I know." That night, Malcolm poured 2 glasses of wine and handed me a new notebook. The cover was blank. Inside the first page, he'd written one line, "For when they finally see it." I knew what he meant. Not when the family changed, not when they apologized, but when the rest of the world started seeing the truth we had held in silence for too long. I printed the parent's email and added it to the folder. Then I pulled out a flash drive and copied over the timeline, the blog entries, the scans, and the final recording. I labeled the drive with a simple word, legacy, and placed it in the lockbox beside the notebook. Because this wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about building a map for my kids, so they'd never have to lose themselves trying to survive the version someone else invented for them. 2 months passed without a single message from anyone in the family, not even the ones who used to send holiday updates or birthday reminders. The silence felt cleaner than confrontation, like they'd finally accepted that I wasn't playing the role they'd assigned anymore. Then Gavin broke the quiet. He didn't call or text. His number was still blocked. Instead, he used Malcolm's school email, a professional line connected through one of Nora's parent-teacher nights. The message was short, just a question. Would you meet me for coffee? I agreed, but only on my terms. A public cafe, early afternoon, no emotional ambushes, and I drove myself. He looked older than I remembered, not in years, but in tension, like someone who'd spent months trying to hold a wall together with duct tape. He didn't order anything, just sat down and immediately started talking. He'd recently discovered that Brielle had shown Lila old texts from our mother, ones mocking my therapy sessions and joking about how I'd been acting sane lately. Lila had cried after reading them, then asked Gavin if what Nora said in her school presentation was true. He didn't deny it. He said he hadn't wanted to believe any of it before, because that would mean admitting how long he'd stayed silent. I didn't argue. I asked him one thing: why he never said anything when it was happening. His answer was quiet. Because I didn't want to be next. I pulled out an envelope from my bag and handed it to him. Inside was a printed copy of the full timeline, parts of my journal, selected transcripts, and a few scanned photos with captions explaining what they showed. He read silently for 10 minutes. When he looked up, he didn't say much, just asked, "Do the kids know all of this?" I told him they know what matters. They know enough to understand why we don't attend family events and why I don't answer certain phone calls. I said I won't let someone else invent the version they grow up believing. That was the end of the conversation. Later that evening, Malcolm showed me a message Gavin had sent him. It was a photo of a handwritten letter addressed to our parents. In it, Gavin wrote that he wouldn't speak to them again until they apologized directly to Nora and Eli. Not just for the things said recently, but for the pattern of manipulation that had poisoned our entire upbringing. He said he didn't want explanations, only accountability. I printed a copy and filed it into a new section of the binder labeled "When They Finally Saw." A week later, Brielle sent an email with the subject line, "I'm sorry." The message itself was vague and careful. No names, no admissions, just language like, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," and "I hope we can move past this someday." I didn't reply. She knew exactly what she was doing when she spread the story. She knew exactly how far it would go. Soon after, Nora's school counselor reached out. She had heard about the family legacy presentation and asked if I'd consider speaking to a parent group about emotional boundaries. I declined. I wasn't ready to make this public, but I did send her a redacted copy of the timeline to share anonymously. No names, no locations, just patterns, just truth. She wrote back and said it was the clearest account she'd ever seen. Summer crept in. The questions from the kids slowed. Eli stopped asking why we didn't visit Grandma. Nora stopped flinching when relatives were mentioned. They began to understand the difference between keeping peace and telling the truth, and how sometimes the two can't exist in the same room. One afternoon, Eli found the old notebook while we were cleaning out the closet. He sat on the floor flipping through its pages, then looked up and said, "I think the girl in here turned into the mom I'm proud of." I didn't cry. I just hugged him and said, "That's all I ever wanted to be." Eventually, another reunion was planned, a big one, meant to bring the whole family together again. We didn't receive an invitation. No email, no call, not even a passive-aggressive text. Just quiet exclusion. That silence felt like the last nail in a coffin I never wanted to build. It was the clearest closure I could have asked for. Because I don't need them to believe me. I don't need their forgiveness or their attention or some half-hearted reconciliation built on false promises. What I needed was to ensure my children would never inherit confusion as truth. I needed them to grow up knowing they weren't broken, and neither was I. I locked the binder, labeled the final drive, and placed both in the box under our bed. And for the first time, I felt finished. Not because the story was over, but because the silence couldn't erase what had finally been written.